Well, thank you, Mayor Murray, for that really great introduction and context setting. And Congressman, I guess one place to start would be where the mayor jokingly actually started, which is with the simple word Indiana, and to get your reactions to what's been unfolding there in recent days.
I was at first, of course, unhappy, but I have now, I want to talk about that as a good sign. The governor of Indiana, a very conservative member of Congress with whom I served, now finds himself very much on the defensive. The reaction to that effort to sanction bigotry has been very encouraging. Indiana is not the deep-rooted heart of liberalism. It's been one of the most socially conservative states. And the fact is that there has been an overwhelming reaction within Indiana against this, to the point where the mayor, look, it's a sign that a politician is in political trouble when he has to say something that totally contradicts the facts, that he knows no one will believe, but he hasn't gotten any other thing to say. So Governor Pence announces that this measure, the sole purpose of which was to allow people to discriminate against gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people, is not about discrimination. That's its only purpose. And when people deny the truth, that's a good sign. Because they know they're in trouble. And what was particularly encouraging was who was against it. Not just the usual suspect of liberals, the business community, the NCAA, not just businesses. You know, it wasn't just the Whole Foods and all the liberal business. I was struck that Cummins Diesel, could there be a more iconic Rust Belt mainstream American company than the people that make diesel engines for big trucks? And they said, this is a terrible idea, you got to stop it. Angie's List threatens to not go ahead. That's very encouraging. And by the way, the reason the business community does it is, one, they don't want to be associated with hate, and two, they understand this kind of bigotry is bad for business. So I don't know how this ultimately ends, but it is a further indication of how much we have progressed. And I think no matter what Pence tries to do here, it is very unlikely that any other governor, no matter how angry he thinks he may be at us, is going to try that again.
Do you think that when social norms shift like this, as they appear to be on this, in this case, that it's bad for business is a sure sign that the game is about to be
over? No question.
Over?
First of all, the business community we were used to it being on the more conservative side. And yeah, because this is the neutral norm. There are people who have ideological values one way and people who have ideological values the other way. And then there is a very important value in America, legitimate, because I believe in the free enterprise system, it's making money. And when people decide that something is bad for those who want to make money, that's a very powerful obstacle to their going ahead with it.
One of the things that Mayor Murray really laid the groundwork for, and is such a deep and running theme throughout your book, is something I want to begin speaking to, because even that comment about the measure of how the business community feels about an issue as one pragmatic indicator of where things are. There is a deep, deep thread throughout this book, which, if you haven't started reading it, it's just, I just have to say at the outset, it is a delight to read. I have read more than my share of political memoirs, and this is just really an incredibly insightful, self-aware, but also informative, textured look at how power operates, right? And I think one of the things that is so notable about that, and one of the running themes in this book, is how an appreciation for the pragmatic, for what might seem to impatient activists as incrementalism, is not just something that you have to remember, but is almost core to the enterprise of politics. Can you say a bit more just about kind of
Sure.
This view about incrementalism and its benefits?
Well, first of all, I'm a great believer in free speech. I'm always very clear. Hate crimes, I'm for adding LGBT. That is, if someone assaults someone else, defaces his or her property. But I have never been for criminalizing hate speech. I believe in free speech, and if you believe in free speech, that means you believe obnoxious people should be able to say hateful things. But if I was going to start making exceptions and outlaw certain patterns of speech, I would make it a misdemeanor to use pragmatist and idealist as if they were opposites. They, in fact, have to go together if you want to do any good. Of course, you begin with your ideals. You have no business using the coercive mechanism of government to get other people to do things, unless it is in support of a genuine vision of making things better. But once you are committed to a set of ideals, in fact, the more deeply you are committed to ideals, the more you are morally obligated to be pragmatic. Ideals that people hold, indifferent to whether or not they are implemented, are a great indulgence. They bathe you with this warm feeling of moral superiority, and they don't feed a hungry child, or house someone who's homeless, or clean up a river, or do anything else that's any good for anybody. So pragmatism in this support of your ideals is absolutely essential to your being of any good. As to incrementalism, I have never heard of any great evil that was abolished all at once. In fact, the notion that you could do that is, in a word, stupid. Things do not exist in society that have no basis whatsoever. There are no phenomena, including those you dislike, that just fell to the earth with no real roots. The very fact that something is there and has been obstructive to you means that it reflects forces in society, and you have to muster counterforce. And the notion that you can do away with it all at once is very unlikely. Secondly, it is almost always the case that winning a partial victory leads to a further victory, because you have banged away at the rationale. When we won some victories on LGBT issues, we helped defeat the notion that, oh, this is going to lead to these other problems. And by the way, one of the problems I have with some of my LGBT associates, particularly the younger ones, is they totally misread the history of the African American movement. People should read Parting of the Waters by Taylor Branch about Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was an inspirational moral leader and one of the smartest, we would say in Boston, one of the cutest political strategists you ever saw, because he understood, you go here, you pull back, you do this, you do that. He had a great sense, and just one last issue that people forget. In the post-World War II period, when the black community wanted to go after segregation as it had been embodied in the 1896 Plessy decision, their first Supreme Court challenges did not say that separate but equal was unconstitutional. They said that separate but equal isn't being fairly applied, that they say it's separate but equal, but it's not equal. And Thurgood Marshall and his colleagues won lawsuits originally in Oklahoma and Texas, not challenging the doctrine of separate but equal, but saying in practice it isn't equal and you have to treat us better. And that was a way to undermine the whole separate but equal. First you prove that separate but equal was in fact impossible, and then you went after it. So the alternative to incrementalism is self-righteous frustration.
Or perhaps, as we've seen in Tea Party politics over the few years, a maybe dangerous utopianism, right?
True, but I have to say this. I wish the Tea Party was as unrealistic as some of my friends on the left. Look, we have this problem. I did not agree with everything in Occupy, and I thought their economics had some problems, but I basically agreed with the thrust of what they were saying, and I very much disagreed with the Tea Party, although there's an element of the Tea Party with whom I've been aligning myself in terms of pulling back America's excessive military intervention. But the Occupy people had very little impact on public policy, unfortunately, and the Tea Party, unfortunately, had a lot. And look, part of the problem is it has been the case that when they are angry and think public policy needs to change, there has been an instinct on the left to march. There was an instinct on the right to vote. And voting beats marching when you're trying to change things.
So one of the things, I mean, it is telling that a lot of the way you unpack that point of view goes back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Indeed, you tell the story in your book how maybe one of the earliest crystallizations of that point of view was the time you spent in Freedom Summer in Mississippi with activists, some of whom took a more kind of non-incrementalist approach, right?
Right, well, you're right. There are actually two fault lines here. One is procedurally. And by the way, as far as the approach, the incrementalism, I was in Mississippi in 1964 as a soldier. I was not in a policy-making position. This was a coalition of every civil rights group, including the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. people like Stokely Carmichael, who later became known as Sekou Touré, who was a great militant. And here's how disciplined and thoughtful and incremental the African American movement was. Our purpose in Mississippi was to demonstrate that black people were being physically and legally denied the right to vote. And the racist argument was, well, they didn't want to vote. And that hasn't totally died. That Looney Tune from Duck Dynasty said, oh yeah, the black people were happy back then. Well, we needed to demonstrate that they wanted to vote and were not being allowed to challenge the seating of the white segregated delegation at the Democratic Convention. So we conducted a model registration outside the regular system to document this. So the key of that summer was to make it clear that people were being denied the right to vote. As the summer began, in July of that year, it was 1964, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill. And it became legal for black people to eat at restaurants and lunch counters in Mississippi, which had been a major cause. And the NAACP and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John Lewis, Stokely Carmichael, Martin Luther King, agreed not to take advantage of that law because we wanted to focus on voting rights. And voting was more important than integrated lunches, although one was going to lead to the other. So the summer of '64 saw the voluntary observance of continued segregation, which had been made illegal in the interest of putting all the emphasis on voting rights. That was disciplined incrementalism that was correct.
You know, of course, Stokely Carmichael not only changed his name, but became the most fierce advocate for, in the title of his book, Black Power.
Black Power,
right?
yes. But he was, in '64, he was still sophisticated enough about how to do it. Well, people have said, well, the black community, Gandhi, they believed in marches and demonstrations. You know, in both cases, in Gandhi's case and in Martin Luther King's case, they relied on demonstrations when the people they were representing couldn't vote. In fact, what did the black community, we got the Voting Rights Act. Scandalously, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the terrible sacrifices to get it, we have a right-wing Supreme Court that gutted the Voting Rights Act. But what Martin Luther King and Gandhi were fighting for was the right for their people to vote. And once they got the right to vote, the role of demonstrations diminished because voting was more effective.
You alluded a moment ago to the generational dimension of this, and it's true both in issues of racial justice, it's true in issues of LGBTQ justice and opportunity, that particularly today's younger generation of activists may not see it the way that you're describing, right? We recently had here in Seattle a group of young activists from Ferguson who essentially were saying exactly what you would have predicted, that we don't need to learn this system, we don't believe in this system, that we're not trying to enter into politics, that what we believe in is protest and not giving the system any patina of legitimacy by even trying to enter it, right? And that echoes, of course, today. How do you cross that generational
Well, fortunately,
divide?
they are very much in a minority because what is happening in Ferguson today, fortunately, is black people voting. And that viewpoint has been rejected. I always ask you, our point is protest. And then what happens? What happens? How does that, I don't understand the mechanism. How does that change things? Now, by the way, demonstrating, marching, that can be a very effective part of organizing. It can be that getting people together can help them if then what you do is say, okay, and now let's start voting. I mean, I complained to an Occupy official that I never saw a voting registration table at an Occupy site. They said, well, that's not what we're into. Well, that's kind of that's giving up. And in fact, well, that's what those people said in Ferguson, those younger people. It hasn't worked. But I neglected, if Eric would let me, an important part of your question, because there were two splits. One is, how do you go about it? The other is, what's the goal? And it was true, both in the movement for civil rights among African Americans and among some in the LGBT movement, there was this notion that we were not trying to integrate the discriminated against group into American society because American society stank. It was bourgeois and stifling and culturally dead, and therefore you take the group that has been denied participation in that and they become the cultural spear by which you transform the society into a much more lively communitarian body. And it was my experience in Mississippi and my experience now that the great majority of African Americans and the great majority of gay and lesbian people have no interest in transforming American society and being the cultural vanguard. They just want to be like everybody else. They want to be able to be left alone and enjoy themselves. And that was one of the problems that some on the left had, but I think overwhelmingly it is clear. Look, there was a point at which some people in the LGBT movement, including a lot of lesbians, who were very angry at the notion of marriage because they thought marriage was this terrible bourgeois institution. Well, first of all, we pointed out that marriage was always going to be voluntary. And secondly, the overwhelming majority of gay and lesbian people wanted to be able to show their love in a formal way and wanted the health benefits and the ability to pay lower taxes. They want to be like everybody else. And I think that's one battle that's been conclusively won. The separatism, it's gone.
You know, you have a line in the book about how, in a self-deprecating way, how bourgeois your pursuits have been of seeking marriage equality, of seeking,
In 2006, a particularly bizarre Republican from, of all places, Indiana, announced in his campaign that if people voted for his Democratic opponent, Nancy Pelosi would then allow me to enact the radical homosexual agenda. I was very pleased that John Hosteller was his name. He lost by the largest margin of any incumbent that year. So the next day, the day after the election, I was addressing the Boston Chamber of Commerce, a very good group. The local chambers of commerce tend to be much easier to work with than the national ones. I see some of the elected officials affirming that. So I said, look, I have to tell you, I come to you with a sense of inadequacy because yesterday in Indiana, the voters, at least one district, apparently ratified the idea that I should come to Washington with a radical homosexual agenda, and I don't have one. I am sorry, but I do have things I want to achieve for gay and lesbian people. Here they are. I want us to be able to get a job, get married, and join the army. Now, in the history of the world, what self-respecting radical would take as his platform, get married, get a job, and join the army? So I had to confess inadequacy.
You know, you say this with that self-deprecating humor, but in fact, part of what undergirds a lot of this, though you may not, I don't know how comfortable you are with the word, is a deep abiding sense of patriotism. What you're aiming to do here is to claim the institutions of the country, whether it is marriage or service in the government or in the military.
I agree with you, Eric, and you know this very well. And as you said, people said they don't want to give a patina of approval to the system. Well, in the first place, participating in the system doesn't mean you think it's good. It means you think it's there. There was a 19th century transcendentalist named Margaret Fuller, a brilliant woman, one of the few women to be an intellectually strong figure in that period. And at one point she said, I accept the universe. And somebody, it was either Emerson or one of those people said, well, by gad, she'd better. Meaning, what do you mean you accept the universe? What the hell is your alternative? You're going to say you don't accept it, it's going to go away? In fact, if you don't like the system, there's only one way to change it, which is to grasp its levers of power. You know, ignoring something never makes it go away. And I accept the patriotism thing. And this is why I think the right has the advantage. And it's a very good point that I should have emphasized more. The right is intensely patriotic, to a fault in some ways, because they would always argue my country right or wrong. And in fact, they complained that Obama apologized a couple of times for things America did. You never apologize for America. By the way, Ronald Reagan apologized for America. When I was in Congress, one of the things I was very proud to do was to sponsor the bill that admitted how wrong we were when we rounded up the Japanese Americans during World War II and made a payment of $10,000. And as chairman of that subcommittee, I got to read on the floor of the House of Representatives words that are still very moving to me. Congress apologizes on behalf of the nation. And Ronald Reagan signed that bill. So don't give me this never apologize baloney. But the right believes more that the system works. And so when they're dissatisfied with the public policy, they blame the people in charge. Some on the left are more inclined to blame the whole system, and that becomes self-defeating. So yeah, I affirm, and look, I have been critical about a lot of what America does, but I'll say this. I want to cut military spending substantially, but I still want America to be the strongest nation in the world. And some of my friends have said, well, that's xenophobic. Why do I want America to be the strongest nation in the world? Because I look at who else might be. It's a question, I mean, frankly, if Denmark could be the strongest nation in the world, I would feel very secure. But Denmark can't be. And if I look at the possible candidates, America is the best. And on many of the values I care about, America is far in advance of the rest of the world. And just because some people misuse a sense of pride in the way our country has developed, there's no reason to ignore its good points.
Well, this calls to mind a recurring line in your book, which is quoting Henny Youngman.
Henny Youngman, I have referred to him as a great 20th century philosopher. Some of you will have to explain to others who he was. He was a comedian of the old Borscht Belt circuit from the Catskills, a kind of a Jewish humor, Milton Berle and Jack Benny and George Burns. And one of the staples of that humor was to insult your wife and mother-in-law. And basically the argument was that men didn't want to get married and women did. And aside, that's been somewhat validated by LGBT people, because a disproportionate number of the marriages of same-sex have been between lesbians. There are, for some reason, more gay men than lesbians in the population, but that in terms of marriages, the lesbians are disproportionately represented. And in America, the split is men and women. And it is true, women were more eager to get married. But they would make fun of their wives and of their mothers-in-law. They said Henny Youngman had the shortest joke in history. Take my wife, please. But one which wasn't really insulting, it was quite profound. How's your wife? Compared to what? I mean, that's actually a pretty good answer. And I took as my mantra every time I had to make a decision in a public context, compared to what? I didn't have the luxury as an elected official, or when I was an appointed official, of creating an ideal solution out of whole cloth. I had to work with where I was, and the question always was, if I go ahead with this, will we be better off than before? Will some of the people I care about enjoy more rights, and will I have advanced the chances that we can do better? On very rare occasions, you might say, well, it looks like an improvement, but it's going to make it harder. That's very rare. So compared to what has always been what I talk about. And yeah, in terms of America, there are very few societies in the world that seem to me, on the values that I care about as a liberal, that have done better than our country. You
allude to having served as an appointed official, and one of the delights of this book is the substantial early sections where you describe your initial entry into the political arena, working in government for mayor, for other elected officials, and of course, in parallel, as you are getting that apprenticeship in politics and understanding how the system works and developing this worldview, you are privately reckoning with your own sexual identity. And you begin the book reflecting on what you were like when you were 14. You say you were a pretty normal 14-year-old who was really into government and politics, except that you also liked the other guys who were involved in government politics. And
no, I didn't like the other guys. I liked, actually, at that point, my own age. So I liked the other teenagers. But fortunately, we are a community with a great diversity and attractions, because if everybody was attracted to the same kind of person, there'd be a long line for few people and a lot of unhappiness. So, this diversity of attraction is very important. But maybe that's intelligent design. I haven't found it in too many other. I haven't found it in too many other manifestations of the world. Maybe that's it. But I was 14, and I was attracted to politics. My father bought a television set in 1940. He was an early adopter, as we said. And I was outraged by the murder of a boy my age, 14, a black kid in Chicago named he was from Chicago, murdered in Mississippi. His name was Emmett Till. I saw the Army McCarthy hearings where people were using verbal skills to tear down this terrible bully and demagogue, McCarthy. So I said, boy, I'd like to make America fairer. And that verbal combat, I'm good at that. I knew I was good at arguing, mostly because I had heard by then, I was 14, a lot of teachers say, stop arguing with me. So I knew that meant they were frustrated. So I wanted to get into politics, but I knew I was gay. And so I believed at that point I would never be able to win an elected office. Interesting, I was also discouraged by the fact that I was Jewish. And one area I want to stress about great progress in America, anti-Semitism in 1954 was a substantial obstacle to careers. That's pretty much disappeared. There were some crackpots out there, but there was no longer a barrier to Jews doing things the way they used to be, and that's a sign that our society is capable of improvement. But I figured then I would have to hide myself to go into politics, and here's my frustration. I wanted to influence I wanted to make society better by using government to influence things like greater fairness, etc. I was afraid I would never be influential in government because I was gay. As time went on and the prejudice diminished, I became influential in government, but by the time I became really influential in government, government was no longer influential in society. And so much of what I try to do in the book is to talk about how I'm happy being gay is no longer a problem. Now I want to make government better. And as I said, when I symptom that in 2012, when I retired from Congress, and Jim and I get married, the first member of Congress to be in a same-sex marriage, still the only one. People polled. I'd been chairman of the committee that did the financial reform bill, and I was told by the people who polled that my approval rating for marrying Jim was higher than my approval rating for passing the financial reform bill. Now, I'm very proud of both Jim and the financial reform bill, but I would not have expected there to be that disparity when I first started in politics.
I want to get back in a little moment, in a little while, to financial reform and to this broader, the case you make for the role of government. But just to rewind a half step, there's a real poignant parallel or contrast throughout the book between, on the one hand, the way in which a lot of your early career, you say very happily, was the result of accident, phone calls that you got that suddenly changed the course of your interests when you thought you were going to go into academia, when you thought you were going to go work in this job, and a sort of openness to that, while at the same time you had this, by what you felt was necessity, this tightness and sense of control that you needed to exercise over your own sexual identity and about just kind of what would be known to whom. How did you reconcile, on the one hand, that spirit of, hey, I'm just going to go where things lead me, and in a sense kind of that risk-taking, entering into public life, with at the same time this need during those early years to keep a lid on things?
That's a good question, and it's a good question too, which made me think about an angle I hadn't really fully thought about. I mean, I wanted to stress the fact that it was often a phone call or a circumstance that I couldn't control that had me taking an opportunity, because there is this model of the young man, it's always a man, women not treated this way, who was so determined to get ahead in politics that he plots and plans every stage of his career, and then winds up as a congressman or a president, I suppose, taken to ridiculous extremes. It's that terrible show House of Cards, which I wish no one ever watched because it is such a benign, baleful influence on people's views of politics. But in my case, something I had no control over came in, and I thought that was important. But at every stage, I had to say to myself, okay, how will this affect my decision to be closeted? And I started out figuring I would just repress my personal life. And I guess maybe I believe this thing people say that I now think is nonsense. Oh, she doesn't need a career. He doesn't need a private life. His career is so rewarding that it does what a private life might do. I've never found anybody for whom that is true. There are needs we all have, personal, emotional, physical, that no career will satisfy. And in fact, what I found as my career took off and I had more public acclaim, the disparity between being a highly regarded public figure and a very lonely private person made it worse. It exacerbated the thing. So I began to, I would think, okay, if I'd move into this next stage, what can I do? Finally, and it became critical at this point, I made the decision when I first ran for office that I was going to be a coward but not a hypocrite. Namely, that I would be a state legislator and I would not tell people I was gay. This was right after Stonewall, when it became possible for the first time to do things in support of the rights of ourselves. But I was never going to be a hypocrite. That is, I would be an elected official if I could be, and I would be an advocate for the rights of lesbian and gay people, even though I would voluntarily deny myself those rights. And I have no patience whatsoever for people who are themselves gay and then get elected to office and penalize other gay people. That's not privacy, that's hypocrisy. And they should be exposed as hypocrites for doing that. But by the late 70s, that was too much of a strain, that degree of repression and self-denial. And I said, this is ridiculous. I am fighting for the rights of gay men to have a good life and then voluntarily refusing to exercise any of them. It's not a sensible way to behave. So I started coming out to my siblings and close friends. And I was in the process of coming out. And then one of those events over which I had no control intervened, Pope John Paul II. There was a congressman in the district next to mine named Robert Drinan, who was a very liberal, very articulate Jesuit priest. And conservative Catholics went to the new Pope, John Paul II, and said, you got to get him out of Congress because he's way too liberal and he's giving people the wrong idea of the church, walking around with that collar and being a liberal. So the Pope ordered him not to run again, creating the vacancy which I was able to fill, leading Drinan to tell me later that he deeply regretted that he had never been allowed near the Pope, because he really wanted to say, Your Holiness, that business where you told me I couldn't be a Congress anymore, did that work out the way you expected it to? I was the result. But
if only the Pope had asked, compared to what, right?
Yes, that's right. Very good. And, well, see, that's the problem of having an absolutist as opposed to an incremental approach to things. The new Pope probably would have asked compared to what. But what happened was, at that point, that I went back in the closet, because I had a chance to be in Congress and I knew I could never do it. So that's the answer to your question. I was easing out, slammed the door, went to Washington and said, well, this is Washington. Maybe I can be privately an active gay man with other gay people, but publicly wouldn't. That didn't work. And so finally, 7 years later, I said, okay. And at that point, by the way, when I did publicly come out and told the newspapers to ask me, and I would tell them, the Boston Globe in particular, I wasn't sure it wasn't going to hurt me. Interesting, many of my liberal colleagues, because they knew I was thinking about this, urged me not to come out because they said, you know, you're our ally on this issue and that issue and the other issue. If you identify yourself as gay, you'll become a one-issue guy. Your influence will be diminished. My answer to them was, I can't tell you that's not true. I hope it isn't, but I can't live like this anymore. It's making me be irresponsible, etc. And in fact, it did not turn out to be the case. By the time it was 1987, in the midst of the AIDS crisis, I wasn't sure how it would be received, but it worked out well.
It calls to mind a brief story you tell in the book that when you did come out or about to, and you told then Speaker Tip O'Neill that he sighed in disappointment and sadness, and you thought maybe at first it was because you were gay, but then he said, no, it's actually...
No, he was sad for me. He was a great mentor to me. I lived... in fact, I got a nice phone call today, because I talk about Tip O'Neill, and I got a phone call today from his son, who'd been in the legislature with me, saying, we love the book and we want to do a book party. And I was pleased, because I'd written a lot about his father. But Tip told me he was sorry because he thought, very flatteringly, that I might be the first Jewish speaker. And he was sad because he believed that my coming out was going to be the end, or as he told it, I misstated in the book who he told. He told Mike Barnacle, the journalist, Mike, I'm afraid Barney Frank is all through in politics. I said, why? Well, he's very talented, but I hear he's going to come out of the room.
That's what larger-than-life people do when they come out of the closet. They come out of the room, right? Well, I want to return now, just before we go to some of the questions that have been submitted already by folks here. Back to the second big strand throughout the book about the role of government and your view. I mean, one of the things you observe is that Democrats, even when Democrats are not in power, bear essentially, in the court of public opinion, the burden of defending government, right? So when things go wrong with government, they blame Democrats.
Let me give you the best example. By the way, the Democrats have had control of the House, the presidency, and the Senate for exactly 4 years since 1980. Your 2 years with Bill Clinton, when Eric worked with my brother in the administration, and the first 2 years of Barack Obama. So we are held accountable when for 31 of the 35 years we did not have the power that people attribute to us. And as an example of how we get blamed when people are mad at government, no matter who is in power, take bailouts. People hate bailouts, and many people will tell you that it's the Democrats and Obama that did all these bailouts. There were 5 bailouts during this critical period. Bear Stearns, AIG, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the auto industry, and then the banks in general through the TARP. Every one of the 5 bailouts was initiated by George W. Bush. 2, he both initiated and completed without congressional involvement. In 3, Congress intervened. In one case, fortunately, with the auto dealers, with the auto companies to help save them better than he wanted to. But all 5 bailouts were Bush, but people blame Obama for the bailouts. And yeah, there is this, the Republicans benefit because and it's true, we believe much more than they do in government, but we then get blamed for their mistakes.
So one of the things that I think is interesting about your defense of government that runs throughout the book is reckoning with particularly a lot of working class whites who have left the Democratic Party over the last generation. And you say it's not for the reasons that are often bandied about by pundits, which is gods, gays, and guns, right, to use that formulation, but that it is simply because in their perception, government hasn't delivered for them economically, that their economic living standards have declined and they blame government.
I'm convinced even more of that as I think about it. Guns is a problem, and we have to accept the fact, look, one of the great parliamentarians in our history, and that I served with, Tom Foley, Speaker of the House from Eastern Washington, became the first Speaker of the House in a long time to be defeated for re-election because he advocated sensible gun regulation. And that was a critical effort in his factor in his losing in 1994. Not the only one, but a critical one. The proof that it's not the social issues, which people argued for a while, including Thomas Frank and what's the matter with Kansas, and I thought there might be something to that. I was always a little bit worried about its accuracy. But here's the deal, and I should have been more explicit about this. My book chronicles, I think everybody accepts, the fact that there has been a precipitous decline in anti-LGBT feeling at the same time that liberals have lost support among white working class men. Well, if it was because we were identified as pro-gay that we lost them, then those two couldn't have happened at the same time. I mean, white working class men are as little homophobic as anybody else. I think, and it's, by the way, it's not because of religion. Nobody's lost because she or he wasn't religious. And the only people recently who have lost on the abortion issue were two Looney Tunes Republican candidates for the Senate in 2012 who talked about legitimate rape and God wants you to have that baby that was a result of rape. I mean, so what is it? Here's what it is, it seems to me. From the beginning of World War II until early 80s, if you were an American willing to work, particularly after World War II, people got demobilized, America dominated the world because we came out of World War II with the only functioning economy in the developed world. Everybody else had been physically destroyed and the manpower taken away. So Americans made anything and sold it everywhere. And if you were an American without any particular advanced skills or degree, but you were willing to work, you could go into a factory and make a good living. You could become a member of the building trades and help build this country with all the deferred stuff from World War II. But by the mid-70s, that was starting to change. The oil countries were raising the price, squeezing us a little, and the rest of the world was catching up to us. And by the 90s, it was no longer the case that Americans could just go and do manufacturing. So what's happened, and it's been exacerbated by our trade policies, the way we dealt with them, and the way it is today is very simple. The great increase in wealth, and America has done better than any other developed country, has gone disproportionately to a small number of people. And those white working class men, I say white working class men because if you were black or a woman, you did not have the same opportunities in the 70s that white working class men did. But white working class men now find their relative economic position has eroded. And the problem is not that they don't believe in government philosophically, but that they do. They believe deeply, instinctively, that if the government really cared about them, then they would not have been so badly treated. And it wouldn't have happened under Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. So they blame the current Democrats because we have not put forward public policies that have alleviated their distress. That's where the social issues come in. Some do argue, oh, it's because they only care about women and blacks, but it's not that primarily. It is a sense of abandonment. I don't sing good, but some of you remember the song Winchester Cathedral. Winchester Cathedral, you're letting me down. You didn't do nothing when my baby left town. You could have done something. You didn't do nothing. That's their view of the government. The government didn't do nothing when their economic position was being eroded. And here's the frustration. Because they're mad at government for not helping alleviate their economic situation, they punish government by voting for people who don't like government. And that makes it even less likely that we'll be able to do anything. And so they perpetuate this problem that they object to. And I'm convinced, if we were to get the revenue to expand government programs in some areas, we could alleviate their distress. For example, we could have a massive construction program to not just repair but expand the infrastructure. We could, in this country, usually put everybody in the construction industry to work with overtime and bring in new people. And by the way, by now, thanks to technology, the construction industry can be integrated by gender because there is not as much brute strength required. So we could hire a lot of people in the construction industry. We could have a situation where if you were good enough, intelligent enough to go to college, you could go for $1,000 to a good state university, which used to be the case, and now it's been gone because we've taken the money away. We could move Medicare down from 65 to 55. That would take an enormous burden off working people worrying about their retirement. We could do a lot of things that would make those people, white working class people, less unequally treated. We could give them more of a sense of economic security, and that's a twofold thing. It's good in itself, and it reminds them that government is a source for good, that government can be productive of these benefits. The problem is that we don't have the money to do that because you're not going to get taxes raised. I mean, this current right-wing Republican group is letting Dwight Eisenhower's legacy literally crumble in the interstate highway system. So my proposal is to find the money to expand those government programs that improve the quality of life while diminishing inequality, and you find them in two places. You reduce our overly extended military budget. If we hadn't gone into Iraq, we'd have had $1 trillion or more that we could have used. And we don't need to be the policeman of the whole world. Yes, we need to defend ourselves. Yes, we need to protect others in some cases, but we are greatly overextended. I'll give you one example. Well, you know, it's sensitive here in the place where you make a lot of airplanes. The largest air force in the world is the U.S. Air Force. Do people know what the second largest air force in the world is? It's the U.S. Navy, exactly. Now, on the assumption that the Navy and the Air Force will not go to war, we could probably reduce one or the other without endangering our security. Secondly, in addition to reducing, and you reduce the military by not intervening where we can't do any good, where we get embattled in trying to make, the military can stop bad things from happening. They can't go into Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen or any place else and create a coherent society where there is not among the people the willingness to do that. And we get bogged down and waste a lot of money. Secondly, as you have led the way here in Washington, we can stop criminally prosecuting people because we disapprove of their choice of recreational drug. And that would save an enormous amount of money. And I would object to two things. No, it is not possible to fulfill the current agenda we have set ourselves for the military interventions around the world less expensively. Because I will tell you as a member of Congress, yes, I will vote against some of those interventions, but if we send our young people into war, I have a moral obligation to make sure they are protected. We're not going to wage war cheaply. As for the criminal justice system, people have said to me, well, why does it cost so much? Let's make it more efficient. Why does it cost more to send someone to prison than to send them to the state university? Well, there's a very easy answer. People do not try to escape from the state university. When you send people to a place where they are confined against their will 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, it costs a lot of money. And there is no reason, people hit other people over the head, I want them locked up. But the notion that people who are using recreational substances, which do not cause them to hurt other people, I mean, that includes heroin. Nobody hits anybody else over the head because he's using heroin. He hits people over the head because he needs the money to buy the heroin. So you could take the violence out of this. And I wish people wouldn't do these substances. I wish a lot of things. I'm ready to try to discourage people from doing it. But I do not think we can set ourselves up to insist and criminalize poor choices that people make. It's not a free society when we do it. And there's not enough money in the world to keep people from making those choices on their own. If we had that amount of money, I believe we could, in fact, improve this society. We would diminish inequality. One other thing we should do, I just want to throw in, to diminish inequality that doesn't cost money. And I think liberals have been a little guilty here. People are just waking up now to how important labor unions are in making sure that working people have a decent wage. And that's, you know, we have a Republican candidate for governor, Scott Walker, whose major attraction to his fellow Republicans is that he is a buster of unions, private and public. And I hope white working class men will understand what a danger that is to their economic future.
So I want to turn now, Congressman, to some of these questions. And actually the first one in the stack here picks up on a bit where you left off. I mean, the more you read this book, the more you see the ways in which it is not easy to put Barney Frank into a pigeonholed category, right? I mean, there's for all the caricatures that your opponents on the right have made of you as a radical liberal, there is this through line of identification with the blue collar and almost against elites, and there's a through line of, as you said, of this kind of happily bourgeois approach to things. But one of the things that is also a through line in the book is how and when to use wit and the force of ideas, both to beat the other guy, but also to win other guys over. So here's the question. What can we do to stop this apparent attitude of, quote, I'm right, you're wrong, so shut up till you agree with me, which seems to have permeated Congress and our political structure?
Thank you. And I will, as far as yes, I do believe my tastes are similar to those of most people. That doesn't make them better or worse. But I think there have been times in some areas where my liberal friends have at the upper end of the socioeconomic scale, try to impose an aesthetic that is not widely shared. And you're telling people they can't have a job because we don't want climate change. That's very important. But if we don't want them to have a job because of some aesthetic consideration, I think that could be a mistake. And I quote here a great man, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was once encountered leaving a burlesque theater in the early 20th century, and someone said, Justice Holmes, how do you account for being in a place of such low repute? And he said, fortunately, I am a man of low tastes. And I always thought that had a certain advantage. But with regard to humor, first of all, I fool around because I get bored. And it makes me happy to think of funny things. And I don't have great mechanical skills. I mean, I can still hear Jim in my head when we're home saying, Barney, don't touch it. Oh, I can't get this open. Don't touch it. I'll do it. I'll fix it. You'll break it, which is true. And I don't have any great musical abilities, but I was born with a good sense of humor, and I enjoy it for me. But there are two things. First of all, humor is important because you are competing for people's attention span. There's this welter of information. If you can say something funny, they're likely to remember it. You can also use it as a weapon, but I'm going to get to the second part of that question. People don't like to be laughed at, but I've always, with very few exceptions, I have tried to be humorous at the expense of people's ideas or political views, not their personality. There are some cases where, in the case of some bigots, I have tried to be personally destructive. Remembering the British rule, a gentleman is never unintentionally rude. But how do you get away with that? Here's the deal. You ask Republicans to take their party back from the Tea Party extremists. The notion that we have bogged down, yes, it's true, but it's very recent. In 2008, I was the Democratic chairman of the Financial Services Committee. Chris Dodd in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, two very effective partisans. And partisanship done right is essential to democracy. You need parties that stand for something to set the basis, and then you can work things out from there. But we worked with George Bush. I'm very proud. Two people on the back of the book who talk about what a good book it is. Elizabeth Warren and Hank Paulson, Bush's Secretary of the Treasury. And I disagreed with Republicans throughout my career. And then came the Tea Party. So this notion, and by the way, it didn't begin just with the Tea Party. It began with Newt Gingrich. There's a very good book by Martin and Sue Tolchin, T-O-L-C-H-I-N, and then a follow-up by Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann. It's even worse than you think. What happened was Newt Gingrich came to Congress and decided that the Republicans would never take power unless they demonized the Democrats. And he explicitly said, the then leader, Robert Michael from Illinois, he's not a good minority leader because he treats the Democrats as honorable people with whom he disagrees. And we have to say that they're corrupt, etc. That began to work, and that started. But even then, there was a comity between the parties. We got things done to some extent with cooperation. Ted Kennedy helped George Bush pass No Child Left Behind. I voted against it. I didn't like it, but it was not, we didn't go to war over it. And then came the Tea Party. So this, I hate you, you're wrong, I won't tolerate you, is a relatively recent phenomenon. Now, the Tea Party started it. Democrats have had to respond in kind. But what ends this is if the Republican, and it didn't used to be that way. I got a phone call before I come out here. Some of you will remember John Miller, a very good Republican, a reasonable Republican from the suburbs of Seattle. And he called me to say, hey, I hear you're on a book tour, come see me. But in California, he's not here anymore. There's no place in a Republican politics today for John Miller or for Joel Pritchard or for Dan Evans. And what we need to do is I can't help, the reasonable Republicans have to take their party back, because that's where this I hate you, I won't listen to you element comes in.
Next question, which you touched on a bit in thinking about all of the the experience of going through the financial crisis, which is itself a book that you could have written, and those final chapters in the book recounting that are really powerful. But this question is, do you think the reforms that are enacted through the Dodd-Frank law are in danger of being rolled back? What's your assessment of how effective they've been X number of years now since enactment?
Well, obviously it's early. One thing I can say is the right-wing argument that it was going to destroy the economy, if what we did was to destroy the economy, boy, would prosperity be impressive, because in March of 2009, when we announced what we were going to do and essentially did it, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was 6,500. It's now just short of triple that. Americans have the best economy in the world. The unemployment figures have been enormous. We've created millions of jobs. So clearly it has not hurt. I believe it has helped. The Consumer Bureau has already begun to do some things. AIG came to the Bush administration in the fall of 2008 and said, we owe $85 billion that we can't pay in debts. Can we have that money? Because otherwise the economy will collapse. So Ben Bernanke gave them the money. That was a Bush bailout. A week later, the Bush and Bernanke and Paulson were totaling up money they needed. They said, we need $85 billion for AIG. We said, you already did that. So they said, no, AIG came in. They didn't need $85 billion. They needed $170 billion. They were $170 billion short of what they needed. The guy who founded the company is now suing the federal government. We were unfair to him, he now argues, Mr. Greenberg. At any rate, that couldn't happen anymore. People, one, can't make the bad loans. We outlawed them that they'd been making that caused the problem. They can't get this deeply in debt. So I am pretty confident that we have made it highly unlikely that there will be another crisis caused by the same things that caused the last one. Nobody can predict what new things would be, but we have at least empowered them to deal with it. As to what do I think? That it's very secure. The president did sign a bill with an amendment that shouldn't have been in there, and I wish he'd vetoed it. It wasn't a huge weakening. It was something. The outcry against that from Nancy Pelosi, from Elizabeth Warren, from Hillary Clinton, who put out a statement on it, was so profound that I am now very confident. I talked to people there. I've talked to the Secretary of the Treasury. There will be no weakening of that bill between now and the end of 2016. The president would veto any. However, whether or not we maintain financial reform is one of the issues that will be decided in the next election. So will the question of whether or not we do anything about climate change. So will the question about whether we do anything about unions. Whether or not, and by the way, the terrible decision that allowed corporations to flood the zone with money was a 5-4 decision a few years ago. Ordinarily, Supreme Court decisions are not reversed, but a very controversial 5-4 decision within a few years is not firm. And if the next president appoints the right Supreme Court justice for the right vacancy, that should be overturned. So the answer is, I am very confident that financial reform is safe until the next presidential election. And if the Democrats win the next presidential election, it will then be long enough to be deeply embedded. But if the Democrats lose and the Republicans win, we will go back to the bad situation we were in before.
By the way, one of the interesting insights in the chapters you have about financial reform and the crisis is that contrary to a lot of popular perception, it's not so much that the big Wall Street financial institutions tell Congress what to do and that Congress bows to them, but that rather organized people rather than organized money makes the difference. Organized people like car dealers, insurance agents, realtors,
Look,
community bankers.
The lobby for the bad loans came in part from the people, from the realtors and the home builders who want to be able to do this.
Next question, shifting gears here. How can we ensure a new Employment Non-Discrimination Act passes in the future?
Very simple. Elect a Democratic House, President, and Senate. And if that sounds partisan, that is the reality. There are very few issues where the gulf between the two parties is as wide as LGBT rights. Unions is one of them, abortion is another, financial reform, of course. But if we get a Democratic House, Senate, and President, the next time we do, they will pass a non-discrimination bill that will be transgender inclusive. We didn't have the votes for that. It's interesting. From 72 on, I saw people get used to us who were gay and lesbian. I'll be honest, when I first started introducing that legislation in 73, when we began debating it, introducing it in the 72, there was what I can only call an ick factor. Ugh, those people, we don't want to even think about what they do. But enough of us said, hey, look, who is who we are? Get over it. I'm your dentist. What are you getting all freaked out about? I'm in your softball team. I'm your teacher. So they get used to us. But the transgender issue, people had not yet done that. And as late as 2007, I ran into that same problem. We weren't quite there. Transgender, I mean, you talk about transgender, frankly, guys would cross their legs. I mean, it just got them all nervous. And then the transgender community did what they had to do. They said, look, here we are. What are you upset about? Here's who I am. And so we're now in that position. But it is still an article, it is still a negative for the Republicans. Now, the Republicans understand where the public is. Pence made that mistake. You're not going to see much Republican active gay bashing because they know that doesn't work. But on the other hand, they are too deeply rooted with their base to be supportive of us. So it will take the election of a Democratic House, Senate, and President to get a bill that outlaws discrimination based on employment. The next time we get that, it'll be. Now there is this, maybe 6 years from now, if we get a Democratic President and Senate, there may be enough Republican representatives from some areas who out of self-preservation will say to their leadership, look, you gotta let that bill come up. I'm gonna vote for it, you can be against it. But I'm not confident that it would happen until you have a Democratic speaker.
What about the role of culture in speeding that along, right? So one of the things that's interesting about, people have talked about how in the swelling of social norms and changing attitudes about marriage equality, that going as far back as Will and Grace on TV in the mid-90s began through popular culture to express that same thing. I'm your dentist, I'm your friend, I'm your neighbor. There's no ick factor there. Do you see the same thing happening today with the trans community through popular culture and mass media?
Yes, and it's being done better with the trans community. I think there are more compelling, favorable characterizations in the trans community. I was never a believer that having in Will and Grace Jack be an obnoxious jerk was all that good for our community. But I do think that yes, the transgender community with the two series that are going on now, Orange is the New Black or whatever, and the other one, those are actually exceptions to my usual rule that television does not help. Those two, I think, do. And the problem is that they reach the general public, but here's the difference. The Republican Party right now is in the control of a very conservative bloc, namely Republican primary voters. They are an unrepresentatively right-wing group. That maybe they're only 15% of the public, but they dominate that party. And until we find some way for the other Republicans to unlock that, the Republican Party will be opposed. They won't be as aggressively against us. Quoting songs, another one I won't try to sing. I don't sing well, but the Republican Party today, it's all about the base. About the base, no moderates.
The final question I want to pose here, and you've alluded to it a couple of times, but it's just, what is it like now for you out of office and enjoying the life of a still very public citizen? What are the things that you're delighted to be unconstrained to do? What are the things that you miss?
Well, I'm not constrained. I pretty much said what I wanted. There was one area, I mentioned this, some in the book. My editor asked me to. Being Jewish, well, it's a long time since I have had any theological feelings. I did not want to be too explicit about that because I didn't want to look as if I was dissociating myself from other Jews, given the history of anti-Semitism. For example, on the high holy days, I don't go to temple. I will tell you, personal, I think both the Jewish and Catholic religions made a big mistake by translating everything into English. Because as Latin and Hebrew, it was very impressive and poetic. I will be honest and tell you, as English, I don't think much of it. I think it's kind of banal and I'm not impressed with that language. So I don't go to temple. But I will not go out in public on those holidays. I won't be seen in a restaurant because I don't want to be in a restaurant and have someone say to some other Jewish people, well, why couldn't you come to work? I saw Frank out there. That's when I was in Congress. Now I don't feel quite as much of an obligation. Otherwise, here's the deal. I only get to talk about things I want to talk about. I mean, I have the best of that world and I can intervene when I want to, but when you're in Congress, there are a whole lot of issues I don't have to worry about, including, by the way, in financial reform. I never went to Congress trying to referee what very rich people did to finagle. And again, I keep mentioning songs, but in my head only. One of the things I was literally singing in my head as I retired is the old anti-war song, "Ain't gonna study derivatives no more." I never liked them. I don't want to deal with them. And the basic thing is now I don't have any stress. I make speeches, the book, a little stressful, but not when I had nothing else to do. And hey, look, and I'll be honest, I had a somewhat messed up personal life by repression and etc. And I experienced love at 67, a lot later in life than anybody else. And one of the things that is now I get to live it, and I didn't want to miss that opportunity.
Well, one of the things I'm going to do on that note is take a slight liberty. A day early, I'm going to ask, since we're in a hall with great acoustics, I'm going to ask all of you here tonight to join me in singing Happy Birthday to Barney Frank, because tomorrow is his 75th birthday. So, 1, 2, happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Barney. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking Congressman Barney Frank, and please join us outside as he'll be signing books and continuing the conversation. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening.
That was great.